At some point in your chess adventures, you'll probably hear or read about a term called triangulation. Basic triangulation is a technique that allows you to lose a move with the result that it leads to a breakdown in the enemy defense. When I was 13 years old, a chess friend mentioned it, and I quickly changed the subject since it sounded way too complicated. Chess was supposed to be fun, and triangulation sounded boring and possibly painful. A couple years later, I heard the term again, and since I was now serious about the game, decided to see what all the hoopla was about. Though certain areas of triangulation can be very complex, I was shown a side of it that is both simple to understand and useful. This position with black to move is an easy win for white since the e4 pawn will fall. Black comes in, hoping to come in even further and gobble all these pawns. White takes the opposition, and black has no other move than to retreat and allow white to eat the pawn. However, instead of resigning, black will continue the game. King c6. And now white has this majority of pawns, so he has to turn this majority into a passed pawn. So he goes back so he can eventually push this b pawn to b4, and the king is needed for that. Black, of course, rushes over to the afflicted area, and then he thinks he's kind of stopped it. But white has a little trick here. b4 check, temporarily giving up a pawn. Takes it with check, and suddenly the king has to move away and relinquish the pawn that he just won. And now it's very easy. Basically, we just use the pawn to force the king back, and then we just let him have it. And we rush over here and eat these pawns. And it's pretty easy. And black gives up because he's 2 pawns down and white is going to make a queen. In the previous position, black had the move. But here, white has the move, and that makes the position very, very interesting. Someone that's not trained in opposition basics would probably play king e3, which loses right away to king e5, when black has the opposition and white is forced to give ground. So white has to lose a move and force black to step onto e5. Only then will white's king move to e3, giving white the opposition and the game. After king e5, in this situation, white is doomed because after king e2, he has to move his king back. The guy can penetrate into your position, king f2, and just start eating everything. And then white has one last hope. Since the king's so far away, can he make a queen over here? You take, and it's not going to work. And sadly, once this pawn's gone, black has an armada of pawns, and it's over. Returning to our initial position where white has to make the first move, have we proven that black wins? Not at all. Black came out on top because white was a bit off about opposition. His king e3 was a form of chessic suicide, giving black the opposition with king e5 and losing outright. Instead of king e3, white's correct choice is king d2, taking distant opposition. Now, after king e5, white can go to e3, and instead of black having the opposition, white has the opposition. And now black is the one that has to move. Another way of doing it in our initial position is king f2. And this is actually called triangulation. I'm pointing to the maneuver of triangulation where you make a little triangle. It's not anything that deep. You can see you go to the right, the left, and you create kind of a little triangle here. So after king f2, we also have something from our previous lecture where we've created a square or a rectangle with the other guy to move, with every corner the same color. And so that means white actually has the opposition in this position. So probably the most instructive try for black, since we saw that king f2, king e3 just failed because white has the opposition and black has to lose his pawn, is black can be tricky, and he can go e3 check and try to get you to take the pawn. Though taking the pawn wins, black has the opposition and he's going to enter the enemy position. So instead of allowing that, white can once again triangulate. He goes king f3, and now when the king comes up, he is the one, once again, with the opposition. This one example was rich in king magic. It features triangulation, which is really nothing more than a fancy way to give up a move and gain the opposition. Basic opposition, distant opposition, and even rectangle opposition. None of these things should be scary anymore. They look really, really complicated, but that's more illusion than reality. However, if your opponents or friends see you use these chess tools, you might want to keep mum and let them continue to view you as a genius. To finish off our king and pawn studies, we'll take a look at a couple tactical endgames. That's right, tactics aren't something you only see in the middle game. Tactics also appear in endgames too. Pawn races are a natural part of many endgames, and sometimes it comes down to simple counting. The idea, of course, is to make a queen before the opponent does. This position is drawn since both pawns will turn into queens. Black goes for the touchdown, white does the same. Black makes a queen, white makes a queen, and black, he can try some checks. And you have to be a little careful. If you stay too far from your queen, you can end up losing it. For example, king f5, and suddenly there's a skewer and you're going to lose your queen. You move your king, he takes it. So you don't want that to happen. But all you do is, on this check, just get closer to the king. And when he checks you, your king guards the queen, and nothing will be left. It's just a draw. There wasn't much going on in our previous position. But what if the race is all about the A and H pawns? Keep in mind that rook pawns are often the exception to the various rules, and this case is no different. One might think that the game will be drawn since both sides are on the same rank and neither king is in the square of the enemy pawn. But the truth of the position is that whoever moves will win since both pawns promote on the same diagonal. H5, A4, H6, A3, H7, A2, and you make a queen, and the problem is the queen covers the queening square of the enemy pawn. So when he makes his queen, it immediately gets devoured and white wins. Quite often the result of a king and pawn endgame depends on pawn structure, with doubled pawns being a true liability. Even though material is even, white should win this position. Both sides have a pawn majority, but black's queenside majority is crippled due to his doubled pawns, while white's kingside majority is healthy. Barring speed bumps, white's winning plan is to march his king all the way to d5 and gobble up all of black's queenside pawns. Another part of white's plan is to turn his kingside majority into a passed pawn. Black understands that he can't win on the kingside. White's pawns on that side will eventually push his king back and ultimately make way for white's king to invade on the queen side. Another winning idea for white is to simply create a pass pawn with his majority and promote it. However, there's more here than meets the eye, and white has to be very careful. C3 is best, but let's try out the logical G3. This opens this diagonal, A1 to H8, so that white's king can rush towards the center. It sounds great. However, it actually loses. After G3, black plays A4. The king does what he wanted to do, So far, so good. And then the bomb b3. Well, obviously, black threatens to capture one of these pawns and make a queen. So you have to take it. He takes, and now you give up another pawn, c3. And now he threatens to take this and make a queen, so he has to take it. But what we've done is we've cleared away all the pawns from the A file. And so this pawn just walks forward and makes a queen. All right, so didn't white have a defense after g3, a4? No, he's dead as dead can be. For example, let's say he says, all right, I'm going to try to block all that stuff. Well, in that case, he just captures, and then he just gives this pawn away. And once it's taken, it's on to the races, a queen. Instead of playing g3, white recognizes this tactical melee here, and he immediately tries to prevent it. So he goes c3, blocking both of black's pawns. Black plays a4. And now it's critically important to play a3. But let's have a look if white says, well, I've already fixed everything, so now I'm just going to get my king in the game. No, you lose again. He plays a3, threatening to take the pawn. He has to take it. Then you go b3, and you're making a queen. And you could have won also with simply b takes c3, also making a queen. So you really have to be aware of this stuff because you can turn a winning position into a losing position the drop of a hat. So after a4, white says no. He goes a3, and now he's completely stopped everything. If black takes a pawn, nothing, totally frozen. If he takes this pawn, totally frozen. If he decides to go forward, the pawns are frozen, and suddenly black has nothing. And now white, after a3, is able to get on with what he really wanted to do in the first place, which was get his king in the middle and use his kingside pawns. So after a3, black brings his king in the middle, which is something you almost always want to do in an endgame. Now he plays g3, getting ready to bring the king up. One last moment of horror. Let's say you're greedy and you say, I can win a pawn. Don't do it. Pawn takes pawn, pawn takes pawn, pawn takes pawn. The problem is you've now freed both these pawns. So he just gives it away and runs for a touchdown. Don't fall for that. Keep these pawns frozen. So back to g3. White continues with his plan and does not get greedy on the other side. The enemy king goes towards the center. White's king can finally move forward in a safe manner. And both kings hit the center. It's important for black to do this, so he keeps white out of this square on d5. Now black doesn't have much to do. He's kind of out of moves, while white has plenty of pawn moves here. So instead of letting the king in so it could romp and eat everything, he decides, okay, I'm going to try this. f5 check. And then we have an en passant move. King takes. And now we could come in, but you have to be a little careful because you're also letting him in, and he might be able to come in and start eating your pawns. So we're going to be a little more careful in that. He's going to just fix his kingside pawns and create a pass pawn, h3. Very patient. So black's king keeps him out, pushes the pawn up, we trade. Black's out of moves, and he doesn't want to let the king in now, so he goes here. And you can win with this f5 check move, but actually the more subtle move is this, since black has no move. He has to retreat, and we just come in and start eating. King e7, and we're actually now targeting this pawn. Don't forget, we could have won by coming and winning these, but this is more instructive. And we just start chasing the king back with opposition. We go for that pawn, he guards it, opposition. He has to move, and the game's totally hopeless, and black really needs to resign. It's time to leave the world of king and pawn endgames and discuss the two most important rook endings in chess. What makes them so important is that they happen all the time. I vividly remember lecturing at a junior event in Arizona. There were several hundred kids there, and many were very young, 7, 8, etc. Though most of the games were at the expected junior level, I was shocked to see the Lucena position on one of the boards. Neither side knew how to handle it, but there it was. I chalked it up to the theory of randomness and was pretty sure that this was the only time the Lucena position would ever appear in a junior event. But the very next day, there was another. And unfortunately, once again, neither child had a clue how to play it. If this position occurs so often in children's events, imagine how often it turns up in stronger tournaments. Thus, it's something you must know. Named after Luis Ramirez de Lucena, a gentleman that was mentioned in our very first lecture, the Lucena position has been used to win games for several hundred years. And as long as chess is played, it will continue to be used. This isn't the Lucena position, but it's a common enough sight. White has a pawn, black doesn't have a pawn, and white wants to turn that pawn into a queen. A rook pawn is an exception, like it often is, which by now shouldn't surprise you. In fact, you would be well within your rights to view all rook pawns as the twilight zone of pawns. Of course, it's easy to say this position is a win, but how does one actually win it? In general, if the defending king can stay in front of the pawn, the game's a draw. So white's best hope to win is to keep his king in front of his pawn and slowly but surely lead the pawn all the way down to the queening square. Don't let the enemy king in front of that pawn. So white moves his king forward. White wants his king to control the queening square, and he also wants to give the pawn some room to advance. For example, if you had played king c5, you're allowing this king to get in the way. You don't want that. So, king b7 is the right move. And black doesn't have much to do. He plays rook a5, b6, and he's just treading water at the moment. And now, rook d2 check. This is an important move, and it takes us to an important rule. When possible, always chase the defending king as far away from the pawn as you can. It makes perfect sense. The battle's raging on the queen side. So if the king starts going in that direction, you know that can't be good. It doesn't make any sense. So, very important rule, chase it as far away as you can. So after rook d2 check, the king moves to the side. He has no choice. White continues making room for his pawn. Black treads water. And the pawn is now one square away from being a queen. But now, what do you do? And this is a very famous position. This is the Lucena position. White's problem is that if he decides, well, all I have to do is get my king out. So if he plays something like king c7, it looks like he's just going to make a queen and win. But it's not so easy because the rook starts checking you. And it checks you again, and you can't move away from the pawn because you're going to lose it. So you guard it. And he checks you again, and then he checks you some more, and you have to guard your pawn. And eventually you get chased right back into your hole. And we're back to our previous position. So what are you going to do? This is very frustrating for a lot of people. The way to win is a technique called building a bridge. What you do is you move your rook up, he passes, and now you come up. And what you've done is after he checks you, And he keeps checking you. And he keeps checking you because otherwise you're going to queen. And now normally in this position, you'd have to retreat back to guard your pawn. But you've set this up as a bridge, and you go rook here, blocking the check and winning the game because he can no longer stop you from making a queen. The bridge is complete. The pawn promotes. White wins. Our other key must-know rook endgame is the Philidor position, where the Lucena shows us how to win with the extra pawn. The Philidor shows you how to draw. Where White's king managed to get in front of its pawn in the Lucena, while also pushing the defending king away from the action, here in the Philidor position, Black has managed to keep his king in play. The parameters of this battle are clear. Black wants to make sure his king remains in front of the enemy pawn, while White wants to kick the Black king away and get his king in front of the pawn. Our first position with Black to move is ridiculously easy to draw. All you do is check the king. King e4, rook e1 check, king f4. There's no way to get away from it. And for example, if he decides to, all right, I'm going to do this, you can just attack his pawn. And if he comes and guards with a rook, you attack it again. And if he guards it again, you just keep checking. And so it's hopeless and the game will be a draw. The reasons Black had such an easy time of things was his good king position and the potential vulnerability of White's pawn. But the other reason was the activity of the Black rook. Much of that activity was possible by the distance of the rook from White's king. This takes us into a rule. In general, you want your rook to keep as much distance as possible from any target. It's a long-range piece, and an attack from one square or several is all the same to the rook. This distance is especially important in the case of a rook checking a king, since the king, a short-range piece, can't challenge the rook without going for a very long walk. Now let's look at the same position and see what happens if White gets the first move. He's able to chase the king to the back rank. Now he brings his king in, and his idea is to check on the back rank and chase the king out from the front, thereby trying to create a Lucena position, which we've seen is a win for White. So Black has a couple ways to deal with this. What are you going to do? Rook d1 check looks great, but king e6, and suddenly you're about to be mated on the back rank. That wasn't particularly good. Your king's going to have to run for it. So instead of that check, you can try another check. Rook check here. But no, e6, and you don't have any moves. The checks are gone, and the threat of rook a8 mate is looming, and it forces the king to run for its life. King d7, we're going to end up in a Lucena position, and you don't want that. So make sure you avoid having your king kicked away from the front of the pawn. Now, let's get to a pure Philidor position. Now we come to a pure Philidor position, one that you have to know. White threatens rook a7 check, pushing the king back. Black doesn't have any checks since his rook is too close to the white king. So how can you save yourself? The technique to do so is the heart and soul of the Philidor position. You play rook to h6. What this does, it creates a barrier along this rank. And after the rook checks you, Black's king goes straight back, and suddenly the king can't move forward because of this rook creating that barrier. So all sorts of things can happen. For example, if White checks, Black just moves up. Nothing has happened, nothing good. So he can't do that. It doesn't improve his game. He can move his king around, but the king can't break that barrier. If white does decide just to take his time, all you do is move your rook back and forth. Don't break this barrier, just keep this barrier. And you wait until he finally pushes the pawn, making the barrier nonsense. Only when the pawn is pushed do you go all the way down. Remember, you want distance between the rook and the king. And suddenly, you're about to throw a deluge of rook checks on that king. Why is this so important? Why couldn't we have done that first? The point is that if you came all the way down before, you're allowing the guy to go forward. And if you check him, you're allowing him to hide behind the pawn. So by stopping him from advancing and forcing him to eventually push the pawn and then going down, he no longer has a place to hide behind that pawn, and the king is now in the open and is going to be endlessly checked. So the king moves, you check, and you just keep checking him and checking him and checking him, and the game's a draw. Notice that if he tried something else, let's say he was going to block with his rook, you can actually move your rook, or you can even trade and go into a king and pawn ending. You go up, you go straight back, and you're back to another position we know with a stalemate. This bishop position is extremely important. It happens all the time. Even grandmasters sometimes forget and fall for it. It's easy to master, and knowing it will enable you to avoid it if you're the superior side, and to use it to save a seemingly hopeless cause if you're the side that's in trouble. The game is drawn, no matter who moves first. If the pawn was anything other than a rook pawn, the bishop and pawn always wins. The other problem is that his bishop isn't controlling the promotion square. If the bishop was a dark squared bishop, it would be a win because it would control the promotion square, but here it doesn't. So, white pushes his pawn, all happy, thinking he's a piece up and he's going to win. And there's no way to get him out of there. You move up, and you can't chase him. And if you ever push this pawn, it's a stalemate. And so the game is just a draw. Incredibly, every position with 6 pieces, that includes the kings, or fewer on the board, has been deeply computer analyzed to its finish. Glancing at our position, since there are only 5 pieces, it's part of that analyzed group. The Endgame table base claims a force mate in 23 moves. Thankfully, the use of these tables isn't allowed in tournament chess, but it still can be quite annoying. I was once playing an offhand game against a strong chess engine that was using these tables, and I reached a position where I had a queen and a pawn versus the engine's lone queen. Suddenly, the machine lit up, and obviously using the table base said, "White has a force mate in 57 moves." Horrified, I moved my queen, and it said, "Mate in 59 moves." In other words, my move was incorrect and made the mate 2 moves longer. It moved, I replied, and this time it said, "Mate in 60 moves." I was going backwards. Enough was enough. I turned the engine off. The computer gives several winning moves for white. But what if white plays bishop to d3? Take a moment and see if you can figure out what black should do. Bishop d3 allows black to draw with knight e5 because the bishop's hanging, he has to move it, and after he moves the bishop, you just give your knight away. And after bishop takes or king takes, we're back to that position where the rook pawn and the bishop of the wrong color, it doesn't control the queening square, means the game will end in a draw. Congratulations. You finished our endgame material and lived to tell the tale. Right now, you might be thinking that you'll never get any of these positions. But the fact is, you'll get them often, and the stronger you get, the more they'll appear. It doesn't matter if you pattern yourself after a positional player or after a crazed attacking genius, these endgames will appear. And when one does happen to make its way onto your chessboard, you'll smile and get a bit excited because you'll know exactly how to play them. Most of your opponents won't.